I need to
Yeah,
watch
I
it
am.
somewhere else. Okay.
Oh, I am.
I can see why your mask is getting stretched out because you keep doing that. I just take mine off. That way I'm not stretching out these straps.
Did you see the one on Facebook the other day that you can actually...
Lyle Smith, we are ready to begin the joint work session whenever you are.
All right. Today is December 8th. It is just before 8 p.m. I'm calling the City Commission joint work session to order. This is the joint session with the Parks and Recreation Advisory Committee. Ms. Riggs, can you call the roll?
Sure can. Give me just a second to pull up the list here. I'll start with the commissioners and then I will continue with the PrAC members. So Commissioner Frank O'Donnell.
Here.
Commissioner Rocky Smith.
Here.
Commissioner Denise McGriff.
Present.
Commission President Rachel Lyle Smith.
Here.
And then we will move into PrAC members. Do we have Doug Neely? I don't see him or hear him. Troy Bollinger.
Here.
And Karen Morey.
Here.
Derek, is it Kugler?
I don't know where the R is from, but Google. Here.
Kugel. Jeffrey Sargent.
Here.
Andy Crump.
Here.
Sean Datchler.
Here.
Brent Haverkamp. All right, that completes the PrAC members.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Riggs. So our item up for discussion is Oregon City Parks and Recreation Cost Recovery Training and Beneficiary of Service Exercise. Mr. Reed, is this your item?
Yes. City Commissioner, thank you for having me. We're excited to have PrAC and the City Commission be a part of this process. Today we will be going over our cost recovery training and our education session. Back in October, our department began working with Amelia Consulting on the smart approach to cost recovery. During this training, we've been able to get some valuable information and data that will help us make better decisions and better manage our resources. Rochelle Parsh, our Aquatics and Recreation Manager, has been leading this project, and she will be introducing our speaker tonight.
Good evening, Commission and PrAC members. Can you hear me okay? Am I coming through?
We can.
Great. Like Kendall had mentioned, my name is Rochelle Anderholm Parsh, and I'm the Aquatics and Recreation Manager. So I get the honor tonight of introducing Jamie Sabak. And like Kendall had mentioned, back in October, we embarked on a 12-week cost recovery project. And this was an objective of the 2008 master plan to come up with a philosophy and approach to cost recovery for our department. So in order to meet this objective, we hired a consultant, 110% incorporated. And Jamie Sabak, who's here with us tonight, is the founder and CEO of 110% Incorporated and Amelia Consulting. So over her career, Jamie has been a practitioner in Parks and Recreation, a university faculty member, and as well as a consultant. Her and her team have been the force behind this, our cost recovery work so far, and they've guided us through this 12-week process. And tonight we're here for phase 4 of a five-phased process. And Jamie's going to go through an educational piece and then explain to us the beneficiary of services exercise. So thank you in advance for everybody's time and input into this process.
Hey, Jamie, I think you're ready. Can you hear us?
I can hear you. I'm hoping I'll be able to share my screen with you this evening. Can someone provide me the ability to do that?
Yes, Ms. Riggs is doing that right now.
Great, thank you.
Looks like you should be ready to share your screen.
Oh, great. Can, Rochelle, I'm looking at you, or Kendall, can you let me know whether or not you can see it? Terrific. Thank you so much. All right. Well, I want to extend my appreciation to all of you for your time and attention this evening. I know you've had a lengthy work session prior to this. So as Kendall and Rochelle both mentioned, we are really thrilled to have the opportunity to work alongside the Park and Recreation Department on this incredibly important effort and initiative. I'm Jamie Sabak. I will just give you a little bit more background about myself. I've been in the field of Parks and Recreation in some form or fashion for over 30 years, 20 as a practicing Park and Recreation professional. My last position was as superintendent for the City of Boulder, Colorado Park and Recreation Department. And the last 10 years, I've spent some time in higher education, as well as having the privilege of working alongside organizations across North America. And most of our efforts have been in this area of cost recovery. I'm going to spend about an hour with you this evening. We'll spend about 30 minutes sharing some context, backstory, training, if you will, on what is cost recovery, but more importantly, why is it important today in the field of Parks and Recreation, and what will this look like, and what has it looked like for Oregon City? And then we would like to ask you all to participate in an exercise this evening. And while I recognize some of you are in the commission chambers and others are at home, I'm going to be asking you all to activate your cameras a bit later so we can be a little bit interactive through the exercise. But I want to share with you again a bit about this process and why this is so incredibly important today to the Park and Recreation field, and obviously to Oregon City Parks and Recreation. We've been doing cost recovery efforts for quite a few years, and as a result of the pandemic, we really had to take a step back and think about how we could make this kind of work and this kind of project more accessible and affordable to organizations. You know, many were really struggling, particularly in the latter part of the first quarter and the second quarter, recognizing that they were going to have to make some very difficult decisions, budgetary decisions, and so on. So we really thought long and hard about how to create a very collegial effort, one that was, again, affordable and accessible to organizations across the U.S. We started cohorts in the second quarter of 2020, and we were really excited when Oregon, we had a group of small park and recreation systems in your area, in your region, reach out and extend their interest in a cohort in the state of Oregon. You can see the 4 agencies on the screen that represent this cohort. We're working with Ashland, Lake Oswego, Westland, and then of course your very own Oregon City Parks and Recreation Department. And I do want to say, before I get into a bit more of the details regarding the project, that the staff have been an absolute pleasure to work with. Kendall, Rochelle, the rest of the team have really been terrific, very responsive, very professional, and it's really been quite pleasant for us as a team to work alongside them. So tonight, again, I'm going to spend about 30 minutes or so with you speaking about this project, the what's and the whys of cost recovery, and then I'm going to get into the process, the details of the process. I'm going to provide an opportunity for any general thoughts, comments, questions that you may have at 2 points in the presentation this evening. And of course, the most important part of tonight's conversation and work is really this beneficiary service exercise we're going to ask you to participate in here a bit later. So I want to start with this notion of cost recovery, and it's sometimes, unfortunately, it's conflated with many things in our field. We have folks that believe when you engage in a cost recovery effort, it really is going to result in increased fees, or it's really about diminishing the service menu we provide. Folks tend to go to the dark side. And we really ask people in our profession, the professionals in our world, to get to the 30,000-foot level and understand that this is really about how park and recreation systems are managing their finite fiscal resources today. For quite a few years, we would refer to our fiscal resources as limited. And today's reality is they have become a finite resource pool. We also have branded this the parks and rec economics of it all. So it's important to understand that while cost recovery is, its foundational pillar of this work, it's really one element of how we think about managing our finite fiscal resources. We also ask professionals and councils and boards and commissions and so on to rhetorically ask themselves whether or not they're smart about managing money, because we believe that this is one of the pillars of this exercise as well. And when we go through this exercise with organizations and with professionals and with policymakers and advisory board members, it's always fascinating to engage in the discussions relative to whether or not they do believe they have been smart about managing taxpayer resources. And that's really the core of this exercise, is to begin to ask ourselves that question, poke the bear a bit about it, and really challenge ourselves to think about whether or not we're having the impacts on our communities that we need to have in this moment in time based upon the investments that we're making, how we're spending our taxpayers' dollars. In addition, it's important for us to understand this terminology, and while it may be, a bit rudimentary to the exercise, many, again, in our profession in particular, have conflated cost recovery with a lot of negative terms and a lot of negative understanding. And so it's important for us to all understand that we're speaking in terms of how we are going to think about philosophically recovering or offsetting the costs associated with delivering services. Alternatively, we've got to understand what subsidy means. And in our reality, obviously, subsidy are taxpayer resources. Another way to think about it is a benefit provided by government, and it's typically given to remove some kind of burden, often considered to be in the overall interest of the public and given to promote a social good or an economic policy. And what we find on the tail end of the majority of projects and efforts in cost recovery is that many organizations believe that they have been somewhat ill-prepared to have the discussion concerning whether or not they have been responsible in spending taxpayer resources or investing subsidy dollars. The ultimate end game here is for organizations to really understand how they're spending taxpayer resources and challenge themselves specifically around whether or not they're having the impacts on the community that they want to have, that they need to have in this moment in time. If we think about cost recovery and subsidy in a quantitative fashion, if we have 10 cents from that service, then our cost recovery is 10%. If we expend $1 on a service, we generate 50 cents, our cost recovery is 50%, and so on the story goes. But these are important terms and definitions for us all to understand, and it's critically important for those in our field to understand these because they are the pillars to this work. In addition, we also spend some time discussing context of the park and recreation profession. And I will admit, as a 20-year practicing park and rec professional, I really didn't become as educated as I'd hoped to become until I actually started teaching in higher education. I taught in public administration and park and recreation administration, and I became a student of the field in that moment in time. And it really provided me a better understanding of the essence of our industry and our field and how we've gotten to the point in time that we find ourselves today. I just want to mention, and I think it's critically important to any work that the public park and recreation profession does around cost recovery, and obviously the public sector in general, is that we recognize that our profession is built on the back of public lands and open spaces and access for all. If we look at a fast or kind of an accelerated timeline, we started as a profession back in the 1600s. A couple of hundred years later, we saw the advent, the evolution, the creation of the National Park System, the National Park Service. Fast forward again into the early 1900s, we saw the playground movement, and we started to see government investing more in park and recreation services for communities. We fast forward a bit more, post-World War II, we started to see more services provided for free at no cost to the users, while we understood that taxpayer dollars were actually paying for those services. We fast forward again to 2008, and we really saw the decline of service menus across the United States and challenges around whether or not parks and recreation should be subsidized to the degree that it had always been. And now we find ourselves in a new economic reality. And we also find ourselves in a place where we have become a profession for something for everyone all the time. And we recognize that we are now challenged to make sure that the dollars that we're spending, the taxpayer resources we're investing, are truly having the impacts that we need to have in our communities today. And the essence of this work is for us to understand where we should be spending taxpayer dollars and where we may have opportunities for revenue generation. But at the end of the day, it's really about the impacts that we're able to make based upon the resources we have at our disposal. I think it's also important to understand that we have been stressed as a profession, and we've been challenged relative to whether or not we're seen as an essential service. For those of us that have been in the field for 2-3 decades, we recall the benefits are endless movement and the fact that we are a quality of life profession, while at the same time we understand that we're not necessarily seen as an essential service when push comes to shove. The illustration on the screen here is to share with you a very high-level overview of a study that was done in 2017 by Penn State University. Dr. Andy Mullen and a team of graduate students actually interviewed by phone over 800 policymakers across the United States and asked them specific questions, really leading to whether or not Parks and Recreation would be one of the first to realize budget reductions if the economy struggled, right? If there were budgetary pressures, where would Parks and Recreation be in the food chain? And essentially what they found was, while most of these officials believed that Parks and Recreation affected many of the quality of life issues in communities and was really a highly valued service, they also believed that it was less likely to contribute to a number one concern of theirs, which was attracting and retaining businesses. In addition to that, they indicated that when there were budgetary pressures, Parks and Recreation was likely to be hit with the largest cut in funding. This was again back in 2017. If we look at an additional study just on the coattails of this one, 1 year later, we found that budgets were being reduced significantly and choices were being made to compromise the infrastructure of park and recreation systems. If we fast forward and we accelerate to today's realities, what we're seeing through our national association and many studies that are being done right now is many organizations across the country are currently facing operational reductions. They're anticipating facing additional operational reductions, and their capital budgets are being zeroed out. So the core of this work is really grounded in the fact that we are having to rethink how we do business in this field. And this is obviously work that's rooted in the importance of cost recovery efforts across the United States. But when we begin to think about how organizations are responding and reacting today, they're doing it in large part to ensure the legacy of their systems. They understand that Parks and Recreation, while an incredibly important service, a highly valued service, a quality of life service, also is in a situation where it's become so dependent on the general fund dollars that it's been compromised. So it's incumbent upon us in this field to think a bit differently about how we're going to secure our bottom line and again provide the critical services our communities expect and need of us today. To summarize some of the challenges that the profession is facing above and beyond the economic uncertainties that we're all facing, we're continuing to see increasing disparities in our communities and a greater need on behalf of community members. We see a lack of revenue diversification amongst many park and rec systems across the United States, heavy dependence on taxpayer resources. We think about our own financial portfolio and we're often told to diversify our revenue streams. And at the same time, again, we see in Parks and Recreation, we're heavily reliant on tax resources. We've got across the country uninformed constituencies. People do not necessarily understand or know how we're spending their taxpayer dollars. Where do those dollars go and where do they not? And why is it that we have to charge fees in Parks and Recreation? Folks believe that oftentimes simply by virtue of paying taxpayer dollars, their taxes go towards supporting every governmental service available. There are, on occasion, unreasonable expectations, again, simply based on the fact that people pay taxes, they believe that they are entitled to all services that they wish to have and they would like to have. We also have concerns regarding the sufficiency of reserves and systems today. Many have been taxed, particularly based upon the pandemic and the economic fallout of the pandemic. Our maintenance backlogs are at a place today where we never thought they would be. The National Park Service has an $80 billion maintenance backlog. Some local park and rec systems, the city of Austin has a $1.3 billion maintenance backlog, and so on the story goes. So it's important for us to understand what our backlogs are and recognize that these cost recovery exercises provide us an opportunity to reinvest in our own infrastructure. We, in some communities, are seeing our competitors who are really our partners struggling. When a private sector health club goes under, we need to recognize that when they are no longer able to pay their taxes, it dilutes the very resources upon which we become dependent. Of course, our history, as I mentioned, and our evolution going from access for all to a very special interest-driven profession, and so on the story goes. So while it might seem like doom and gloom, we all see this as an opportunistic time for us to rethink how we're doing things, and cost recovery becomes an incredibly important exercise allowing us to do that. So what we attempt organizations such as Oregon City is connect the dots between reality and policy. This is a policy conversation. It will come down to what decisions you all choose to make relative to how you will invest taxpayer resources and how you will think about revenue generation, again, with an interest in creating and ensuring rather the legacy of your local park and recreation organization. I like to think about this work as well as a way to balance our social service hearts with our with management principles, right? Oftentimes, and you know, I was a programmer, I was a sports program coordinator when I started, and the idea that we would even focus on the bottom line and suggest that we may be reducing services or raising fees was just a conversation we never wanted to have. And while I appreciate and recognize that we are a social service profession at our core, the reality is we've got to begin to do this kind of work in a more intentional way, because if we can't write the checks, nothing else matters. So this is really, again, a balancing act about how do we ensure that we can provide those critical and needed services in this moment in time by focusing on the dollars and cents of it all. So this is a cost recovery exercise. It's a process, certainly similar to any other planning process. As Rochelle mentioned on the front end, we're diving in with these cohort organizations, a very immersive, intensive process that takes about 12 weeks. And we start here. We start with what is cost recovery? Why is it important? And let's look at where we've been, and then let's think about where we need to head, because it sets the stage for how we will respond and how we will strategize moving forward. I'd like to share with you a few data points here, and this really represents cost recovery of yesterday or yesteryear in our field. I will tell you, back in the 90s, I was the Director of Recreation and Community Services for the city of Bloomington, Indiana, and these data points debuted while I was in that seat, while I was holding that position. And while I was incredibly excited about the fact that we were beginning to talk about cost recovery in our profession during a time when it wasn't necessary, we had money in the bank as a park and recreation field. Government was doing okay at this moment in time. The geeks in the profession, right? We liked the idea that we were starting to talk about the dollars and cents. But we also recognized, while this provided a benchmark of sorts, the suggestion was through our national association that we were all going to look at cost recovery like this. So whether we were in Bloomington, Indiana, or Oregon City, Oregon, or Chicago, Illinois, or Austin, Texas, or Brookline, Massachusetts, the suggestion was we were going to have a 0 to 10% cost recovery expectation for parks and 50% for youth sports and so on. Was not going to work, and it has not necessarily been effective over time, simply because Bloomington is not Oregon City, is not Austin, is not Chicago, is not Brookline, and so on. So we've got to understand that this is not a cookie cutter approach. We can have a methodology that applies, we can have a methodology that provides a framework, but it is not cookie cutter, and we cannot all look at cost recovery for certain areas of our system similarly. At the same time, we also recognize, by virtue of how we structure our system in a sports division or an aquatics division or a seniors division, it sets up social values debates and social values positioning, because we might suggest that seniors can't pay for services or they're on fixed incomes. And the reality is, across the United States, the population with the most discretionary income of any other happen to be older adults. So we really poked a lot of holes in this approach. But again, at the same time, there was nobility in us beginning to have these conversations and begin to think about cost recovery. So what I'm introducing to you this evening is a methodology that we are using that has been evaluated and assessed and analyzed by Penn State University, and this is the methodology that Oregon City is in the midst of working within right now. We refer to it as a three-legged stool, and by completing or going through each of these legs, if you will, addressing the legs, it leads organizations to creating a tax investment and revenue enhancement philosophy, AKA creating a cost recovery strategy. We begin with creating service categories. We're going to be looking at the organization's categories in detail here in a few minutes. Then we conduct a beneficiary service exercise. Again, the primary reason that you're with us this evening, and I'm actually joining you this evening. And then, of course, we conduct an extensive cost of service analysis behind the scenes. So I'd like to break these down for you and give you a little bit more detail regarding each of these legs. So first, these service categories. What are service categories? Why are they important? What do they mean? Again, I referenced this notion that in parks and recreation systems across the United States, very commonly we have divisions like parks and sports and aquatics and events and cultural arts and so on, the story goes. And while operationally and functionally, they make all the sense in the world, right? Like speaks to like. It challenges us when we begin to think about how do we spend taxpayer resources, how do we best invest, how do we most responsibly invest taxpayer resources, and how do we think about revenue generating opportunities. So service categories provide us an opportunity to look through a different lens. It's a different set of optics. And service categories have been part of our profession for 7, 8 decades, yet they've been somewhat dismissed because we change, right? Things change. Youth sports 8 decades ago isn't the same as it is today. So let me give you an example of what service categories are and why they're important to this work. So you can see on the screen here, the little boy on the left, let's suggest he represents a T-ball program in a community. It's quite the uniform for a T-baller, but just play along here. So he's a T-baller in our community, and let's say it's a youth sport, right? And our arbitrary cost recovery goals would suggest that youth sports is 50%. The young lady on the right, let's suggest she's in a ballet program, maybe an intro to ballet class, and she's in the arts division or the dance program of our organization, and we might suggest, well, not as many people participate in arts, or maybe the assumption is it's more expensive, so the cost recovery goal is higher. This is unfortunately how we have established cost recovery goals over the years. But let's take this a step further. We've got a sport program on the left. We've got a dance program on the right. Let's assume for a moment I'm 56 years old. That's not an assumption. That's reality. I'm 56, and I'm going to take a learn to swim class for the first time in my life. True story. I don't like water. I'm not a swimmer. It's a bucket list thing for me. I want to swim. And let's say in your organization, seniors are 55 and over. So I could be considered a senior, or maybe I'm in the aquatics division. Regardless, is my cost recovery 50% as a swim lesson? Is it 25%? We begin to, again, establish arbitrary cost recovery goals based upon social values. The assumption is aquatics is more or less important than seniors, is more or less important than youth sports, is more or less important than dance, is more or less important. Assumption one, service costs another, and so costs more than another, and so on. Service categories allow us to look through these 3 services I just mentioned as similar in nature, because T-ball and an intro to ballet class and a learn to swim class are all introductory level activities, regardless of what my special interest area is or what age I happen to be. So service categories, again, provide us a different lens through which we see things, and they allow us to diminish social values debates and positioning. What you see in front of you, I believe you all received in advance. If you did not have an opportunity to review this before this evening, that's absolutely fine. I'm going to walk through this very deliberately here shortly. But Oregon City Parks and Recreation has created 13 service categories that represent all of the services, the activities, the courses, the classes, the events that they provide to the greater community. And we're going to be looking at these, again, very deliberately here in a few minutes, and they're going to set the stage for the beneficiary of service exercise we're going to be doing momentarily. The next thing we do is we conduct a beneficiary of service exercise, and we had an opportunity this past week to meet with staff as well as some various stakeholders of the community, and this evening we're of course engaging all of you in this exercise, and we're going to connect the dots between the categories that represent your service menu and whether or not the community as a whole benefits from those services or they're more individualized and specialized. Why this is critically important to this work in cost recovery? Well, simply because, again, beneficiary of service provides us an opportunity to connect the dots between services and who benefits. If we look at our more conventional, traditional way of doing business in parks and recreation, if you see the 2 examples on the screen here, they represent aquatics programs. But let's assume for a moment the little boy on the left represents our Learn to Swim program, and the young lady on the right represents our competitive swim team or our master swim program. Now, while they're both aquatic programs, again, in our old way of thinking, we would suggest that these are both 50% cost recovery, right? Aquatics is 50%. But to the contrary, we might begin thinking about who benefits from these services, who has access to these services. The service on the left, we might suggest in our organization is more accessible to the greater portion of our community, while the service on the right is a master swimmer or competitive swim team, meaning I have to have a mastery of a particular skill in order to be able to participate. Therefore, it becomes more individualized and more specialized. So beneficiary of service is a very important portion of this process and this project, and your participation and contributions this evening are going to be incredibly valuable to the direction the organization heads relative to its investment and spending of tax resources. Where we're at this evening is based upon the work that you do, the contributions you provide this evening, as well as what we heard from staff and stakeholders last week. We're going to begin to create a beneficiary of service model that will lead this organization towards creating a cost recovery strategy. What you see on the screen is representative of a beneficiary of service model that allows organizations to begin to plot their categories on the continuum, from those in the bottom left aligning most with the common good or providing the greatest community benefit, meaning these are essential services, translate must-have services with community-wide interests, far-reaching impact that have universal value and are accessible for all, to services in the top right of the continuum, being those that are more discretionary or the nice-to-haves, those that serve more of a self-interest. They have limited impact on the community as a whole. They tend to be more exclusive in nature, and they only provide access for some. So your contributions again this evening, as I mentioned, are incredibly important as we begin to build this model, this illustration, this continuum for the Park and Recreation Department. And finally, the third leg of the stool, which we consider the backbone to this process, right? It's the spine, is doing the cost of service work. And this allows organizations to see what it truly costs them to provide every service they provide to their communities. I liken the cost of service work in the public sector with that of a teenage driver. The public sector for many, many years has focused only on direct costs. And we're seeing a tipping point, particularly with Parks and Recreation taking the lead in local government, suggesting that we've got to begin now to articulate the indirect costs as well as the direct costs of providing services. We think about teenage drivers, you know, most of us, if not all of us, were teenage drivers. Some of you have teenage drivers at home. I know I have. They're gone now. But many teenage drivers believe the only cost associated with operating a motor vehicle is gasoline. And we know that's not true, and they learn that ultimately. But that's how the public sector has thought about costs. We've only accounted for the direct costs, and we've been misrepresenting our reality and not necessarily being as transparent as we can relative to what things cost us to provide our communities. So the cost of service analysis is critically valuable. And Oregon City, as well as the other Oregon cohorts right now, are about 60–70% through the cost of service analysis. Again, I give kudos to the project team here for the work that they've done in not only just collecting and gathering all the important data that we needed on the front end, but staying the course and meeting with us weekly to ensure that we have a high level of integrity and credibility in all of the data that's been collected and is being analyzed. Ultimately, when the cost of service analysis is completed, it allows organizations to see their current cost recovery performance levels, which allows them to make informed, intelligent decisions about what their goals can be moving forward. We want to stay away from arbitrary decision-making as it relates to cost recovery goals. So I'm going to share just a couple of models with you. Again, the framework, the methodology is consistent, yet the outputs are very different. These are examples of what Oregon City's model might look like. The first one is the town of Erie, Colorado. This is a suburb of Denver. They actually completed their first exercise about 5–6 years ago. They're in the midst of an update, but you can see their service categories on the continuum, again, from those in the bottom left, providing for the greatest public benefit, community benefit, common good, to those in the top right, providing for the greatest individual benefit. They went through an extensive cost of service exercise, were able to see their current cost recovery performance, which allowed them to make informed decisions about what their goals could be moving forward. Another example is Lake Bluff Park District in the North Shore of Chicago, quite an affluent community, and at the same time struggling with infrastructure demands and a growing number of families in poverty. You can see a very aggressive cost recovery expectation. If you look 5 service categories on their continuum up at enrichment services, they're beginning to suggest that they're going to recover all the costs associated with service delivery. And then moving up on the continuum, an expectation for excess, if you will, excess revenue generation. Again, their primary intention here, their mission is to generate resources where they can to invest back in their system to take care of their deferred maintenance, their maintenance backlog, which is pretty extraordinary for a system of this size. And they wanted to invest more in social equity interests. They wanted to provide more needs-based assistance. They wanted to make sure that folks could walk to a public space within 10 minutes of their home. So they really were embellishing their social equity commitment and interests in this organization. And the last example I'll share with you, this was completed, this process and this model was completed back in the fall of 2019, about a year ago. This is Louisville, Texas, in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, a growing community in the DFW region. You can see their categories as well as their goals, but the primary reason I like to show this one is because they have flipped the model on its head. Rather than articulating cost recovery goals, they're articulating or illustrating rather their tax investment or subsidy goals. And while we all know it means the same thing, they felt that by showing, illustrating to their boards, their councils, commissions, and of course their community how they were spending taxpayer dollars, it would be a more powerful statement. It would resonate with their community. So these are examples of continuums that have been created. Where we're headed, of course, with your help this evening, is the creation of a cost recovery strategy for this organization. It will be Kendall and his team's direction for us to determine what they would like to call the model at the end of the day, but truly it is a cost recovery strategy. And again, you're going to help us this evening in terms of the ranking of the service categories that we'll begin placing on the continuum. So with that, I'd like to open the floor for any general thoughts, comments, questions you have on the backstory, if you will, the context, the whys and the hows around cost recovery in the process before we actually move into the exercise this evening.
I have a question, Jamie.
Sure.
So can you go back a few slides where, boy, I don't know how to explain it. You had the arrow that went from bottom left to upper right that went through I guess it was that one right there. So it went here, if I'm understanding this right, the idea here is the more individualized something becomes, that the greater cost recovery goal to some extent, right? Is that kind of what I'm understanding?
That's a generalization. That's fair. Correct.
Yeah, a generalization for sure. And I don't want to give anything away, or I certainly don't want to steer any thoughts for the activity. So if I can't get an answer to my question right now, that's totally understandable. But as I look at something like this, I would think in individualized side of things, you're going to have specialized services for underserved, less fortunate, ADAs, those sorts of things. And oftentimes those don't come with a higher cost recovery, but rather a greater individualized program. So that's a little bit different than this model. Am I missing something with that?
Well, it's a loaded question. If you get into ADA, and I'll go ahead and address that. So Americans with Disabilities Act, you have a category called inclusion, and we're going to walk through all of your categories and all of your definitions to set the stage so we all understand them similarly before I ask you to participate in the exercise. While inclusion is individualized, right? If I have a child with a disability, let's call out what inclusion is so everybody's clear on it. And I don't want to assume that you do or don't know, but inclusion would mean if my child, let's say my daughter has a hearing impairment and I want her to participate in your basketball league, your youth basketball league. I pay the same registration fee as everyone else, but your organization is responsible for paying for the the interpreter for my daughter. I cannot pay any more legally than anyone else. That is on you. We might suggest inclusion as a highly specialized, individualized service that you provide. The caveat with inclusion is it's Americans with Disabilities Act is a federal mandate, and it requires you by law to subsidize that interpreter. So inclusion, you may place higher on the continuum, but there will be a little asterisk next to inclusion. This is an outlier here. It's going to go back to fully subsidized simply by virtue of the fact that it's a federal mandate through the Americans with Disabilities Act. So it's a fantastic question. A lot of folks don't understand that. So we want to put the categories where they belong on the continuum, but that may mean that we are going to have to make some adjustments for whatever reason. In this case, it may simply be because ADA is a federal mandate and it requires full subsidy. So you're an advanced student, Troy. Thanks for asking that. It's a great question. When we get into the details of the exercise, hopefully it will create a little bit more clarity for everybody that's participating this evening. So fantastic question.
Thank you.
Okay, Jamie, this is Karen.
Yeah.
I'm a math geek, and going over this from our meeting last week and today, I have some computation questions. I'm seeing this lovely overview of all these figures. I'm not seeing where the figures come from. And I know that, like, the movies in the park, the concerts in the park are free to participants, but they take a great deal of staff time to line up sponsorships to offset the cost. So obviously that staff time is computed into this, but I'm not seeing where and how you arrive at your figures.
Well, I'm not sure what figures you're speaking of, Karen.
When you're saying how much cost what the cost is, how much you're recovering, is that including, you know, sponsorships, donations, whatever, and staff time, etc.?
So I'm happy to have a side conversation with you. We are, as I mentioned, the methodology includes an extensive cost of service analysis, which we're doing right now with staff. Tonight is about beneficiary of service. We ultimately will be completing that analysis, and the staff, the project team, will see the current costs associated with delivering every service in the system, which will allow them to see current performance levels, which will drive decisions about cost recovery expectations or cost recovery targets or goals. So tonight is not about showing you the costs associated with service delivery, but we are conducting that analysis alongside the staff. So you're not going to see that information this evening because we're not complete with the exercise and we're not there yet in the process.
Okay, Matt Geek would like to see the numbers at some point. Thank you.
So I'm going to throw this back to Commissioner Lyle-Smith since she's leading this meeting before I ask my question. Are you calling on people?
Well, I haven't been because I can't see all the participants, but I see Commissioner Smith has his hand raised.
Yes, so my question would be, within each service category, I assume there's a variable within that for cost recovery. And so it's generally the average of everything in that category is meeting the goal, correct?
Can you repeat that, Rocky?
So within each service category, there is probably a variable of various cost recoveries within that group. And so it's the average of the whole that is meeting the goal, correct?
So you pick any category. You could have anywhere from 1 to hundreds of services that fall within that category. We'll see the performance levels for each service within that category. So that will present Kendall and team with a range. They'll use that range as well as budget projections for your subsequent budget years and a series of other, we call them guiding principles, to help them determine what realistic goals and targets can be for a 2-year window. So yes, there's going to be a range of performance. Now, organizations that have gone through cost recovery exercises historically, their ranges are probably more concentrated than organizations that may not have gone through it before. I can't speak to what those ranges will look like right now. Again, tonight's about beneficiary of service. We have not conducted the cost of service analysis. It's not complete, rather. We're in the midst of it. So we don't know what those ranges are yet. But as you see on the model on the screen, once this organization sees its current performance levels for all of the services within each category, it will be one of the indicators that will help them establish what they think their goals can be for the next couple of years. And then the point here is to continue to build upon your baseline, right? We're starting somewhere, and this model will be an opportunity for Oregon City to establish its baseline and begin working towards a series of goals.
So I guess what I'm also meaning is, if you have, let's say, a service category that's goal is to recover 50%. Within that category, there could be a project or a service that comes nowhere close to that, right? So
it's possible, but the intention of categories based upon whether they align with community benefit or individual, that they align with their goals ultimately. And if they don't, this becomes one of the challenges for organizations right now is, are you going to compromise the integrity of the alignment of categories or services with whether or not they provide their individual benefit, or whether you'll say, maybe this isn't the best use of our taxpayer resources and we're going to look at reallocation. So you may have some pretty strong outliers. There's no doubt about it. We see it all the time. The question is, can you shore up the model, again, to make sure your progression of performance aligns with the placement of the categories on the continuum? Very good questions.
Okay.
Commissioner O'Donnell?
I'd say a couple of things. First, I think the last three slides were very informative. If you look at them, particularly the two preceding the last one, you can see that some of the costs as you proceed up toward the upper right are more labor intensive and more capital expenditure intensive. And that makes sense to me. The other part is there's an assignment of cost component to this study. I'll give Chapin Park as an example. There's 3 ball fields there that are used for youth sports. There's also a grassy area that can be used for soccer. There's also a walking area. So, I mean, when the city cuts the grass, how do you assign that cost to the totality? I mean, Oregon City Youth Sports maintains the infields. The city cuts the grass, but people play on there, walk their dogs on there. So, I mean, and part of this calculation starts with the assignment of operational costs, and that's an arbitrary, that's a figure you arrive at somehow. I really don't have a question, more an observation, especially as you ascend these curves. You can see that the service provision, the target audience narrows, and the cost seems to increase with the necessity for staffing and capital expenditure to accomplish it, if the presenter is in agreement with that observation.
It's hard to say I think that's a solid generalization. There are variances to that suggestion, that hypotheses, if you will. But by and large, what we are doing again is suggesting that your cost recovery performance levels will drive your goals, and your goals will increase as your services move up the continuum. The more individualized they are, the expectation is you will invest less taxpayer resource, arguably even consider these as an opportunity to generate excess revenues to reinvest back in infrastructure, maybe towards social equity interests, whatever it is that you want to embellish and you want to strengthen in your system where you think you can make a greater impact. So, interesting comments. All right, any other questions before we move into the exercise this evening?
Commissioner McGriff?
Great questions, thank you.
Yeah, Commissioner McGriff?
Yes, thank you, Jamie. I think that this is obviously extremely timely, and I'm sure that when we started this, we were not thinking that we'd be in a COVID situation. But as we move into this and are in it, obviously our parks, particularly all over the state and all over the nation, are important because they are outdoor spaces where people can actually be with social distancing. So it's interesting that we're doing this now. So when I looked at your slide that you talked about inclusion, I was thinking about inclusion not only of services for different types of patrons with different types of needs. I was also looking at it from the standpoint of a diversity, equity, and inclusion lens. And that gets into the whole conversation that you're having us talk about in terms of beneficiaries. You know, how do we help supply recreation for those who are least able to pay? And how are we, you know, looking at this from a standpoint of trying to help everyone, but yet, on the other hand, recover our costs. So I think, you know, one of the things that, even though we don't have a specific DEI lens at this point for Oregon City, we hope to in the future, I hope. But that's something that I think when we're looking at this that we need to be very cognizant about. So I just wanted your thoughts about that.
Yeah, great comments. I could talk all night long about this, and I'm sure you all don't want me to, but I'll share a couple of quick thoughts in relation to and in regard to your comment on inclusion. So keep in mind the list of services we're going to walk through this evening, and you're going to rank. When we say inclusion, we're talking about services you provide. Now, inclusion is an outlier because if you think about it in its kind of pure raw form, it's a cost of doing business, right? Providing an opportunity for a person with a disability to participate in any service. When you're speaking of it, we're speaking of it in terms of equity and inequities in communities and kind of this inclusive philosophy that we carry as organizations. A couple of thoughts, and these are just thoughts for you to think about, and I know Rochelle has heard me mention this a few times. We're in the midst of some really interesting conversations with an organization in Illinois right now about the fact that they've got a pretty vocal older adult population who are not happy about rumors concerning increased fees. In this particular community, that older adult population happens to align with what I mentioned earlier. They have more discretionary income than any other in the community, yet they just don't want to pay more. So there's an ability to pay versus willingness to pay conflict at play. The challenge is when we as systems in the U.S. continue to subsidize populations or interests that are not necessarily benefiting the community as a whole or the common good, we're compromising our ability to invest in those who need help. So we can't suggest that universally every older adult can afford or can't afford. The reality is we have a little bit of both. Same thing with young families or anyone else in communities. So these cost recovery strategies, when we really push the envelope and align our services with community benefit or individual benefit, and we price appropriately into market and what the market will bear, and we price based upon ability to pay, it allows us then to generate those revenues and resources that we can invest in services like what you're suggesting, maybe fill gaps in communities, address need, address inequities, and so on. So it's a very heavy conversation. It's a very complex conversation, but it's one of the noble, important purposes behind this work is for us to align our services with whether or not they provide for the common good or more individualized, and then price, if you will, appropriately, and also invest appropriately. Because at the end of the day, we're just trying to make global impacts across the board. So that's a really, I appreciate your comment very much.
Okay.
All right. Well, I'm going to go ahead and move us into the exercise for this evening. So once again, thank you all so much for your very thoughtful questions and comments. So we're here tonight, obviously, other than to provide you some context around this project and this process, but it's to have you all share with us your thoughts and perspectives on the placement, the ranking of these service categories based upon their alignment with common good or community benefit and individualized. So I'm going to take a couple of minutes and we're going to very deliberately walk through each category as well as the definition, and then just a few examples that allow you hopefully a little more clarity concerning what these categories represent, what kind of services would live under the title or the head of each of these categories. Now, Oregon City, again, has created 13 categories that represent their entire service menu. Our working draft was dated 12/4, so this is will continue to be a working draft until our project is complete. And frankly, This is intended to be, it's not a static exercise, right? Long after our process and project is over, we hope that the organization can continue to polish and enhance and strengthen these categories. So they're in no particular order right now other than alphabetical. We'll start with community events. This category includes annual events that are appealing to a majority of or your entire community, regardless of age, ability, skill, family composition, etc. These events are large scale and highly intensive and typically occur on an annual basis. Examples here are your summer concerts, your movies in the park, Arbor Day, Enhancement Day, Memorial Day celebration, Day celebration, Day of Remembrance, Heritage Day, and so on. Your next category are your drop-in access services, which includes activities which do not require registration, are non-instructed, yet self-directed, and include staff and volunteer supervision or oversight. Examples here are open public swim, indoor playground, Pioneer Center billiards, and board games. Your enrichment and wellness category includes classes, clinics, workshops, and other led or supervised activities in which pre-registration is required, and the primary intent is to provide socialization, interaction, and life skills development with a focus on education and lifelong learning. Examples here are your day camps, preschool enrichment, youth and adult field trips. Next are your food and beverage items, which include the availability of consumable goods for purchase at various department facilities. This includes things like vending machines, event vendors, Pioneer Center coffee station. Next are your human services, which focus on prevention as well as remediation of life challenges and maintaining quality of life, independence, and connection to the community by linking and or providing resources for those in need. Examples here include home visits, transportation services, meal services, case management, information and referrals, veterans counseling, and foot care. Next is inclusion, which provides access for individuals who require reasonable accommodations to participate in city services. Inclusion complies with the Federal Americans with Disabilities Act. Examples here are inclusion assistance for participation in any city activity. Next is merchandise for resale, which includes non-consumable goods for purchase at various facilities. Examples here are swim goggles, maps, and brochures at Ermatinger House, and I apologize if I didn't pronounce that correctly. I never do. Next is open access, which includes open access to parks and park amenities and does not include staff, volunteer supervision, or oversight. This is things like outdoor basketball, outdoor tennis, access to playgrounds, spray parks, public art, trails, pickleball courts, just in general, your public parks. Next are rentals, which includes park, shelter, and facility rentals providing exclusive use of public spaces and places within your system. This includes things like aquatic facility rentals, Pioneer Center rentals, park shelter rentals, athletic field rentals, and so on. Next are your skill-based advanced competitive activities, which includes classes, clinics, workshops, and other led and or supervised activities in which pre-registration is required and the primary intention is to enhance, further, or master a skill. This includes things like personal training, private swim lessons, adult sports leagues, etc. Next are your skill-based beginner intermediate activities, which includes classes, clinics, workshops, and other led and or supervised activities in which pre-registration is required, and the primary intention here is to acquire or learn a skill. Examples here are swim lessons levels 1 through 5, school swimming lessons, entry-level senior aging adult contracted classes. Your 12th category are your special events, which includes events that are intended to serve a target market and or special interests and may require pre-registration. This includes things like your pool Easter egg hunt, swamp swim, daddy-daughter dinner dance, and so on. And finally, your specialized services category includes services that are commercial in nature and whose operations align most with those offered by the private sector. And your example here are your cemetery operations. So with that, those are your 13 categories. Any questions that require clarification on any category before I actually provide you the instructions for the exercise? All right, hearing none. So this is my ask of all of you this evening. So we're going to go through this beneficiary of service exercise. I'm going to ask you to do this exercise independent of one another. So those of you, for example, in the council or commission chambers rather, please plan to do this exercise independent of one another. When we're finished, however, I'm going to bring everyone together. I'm going to ask you all to activate your cameras, and then I'm going to share with you how I'm going to ask you to tell me how you placed or ranked each category. So allow me to set the stage, share a couple definitions with you, a couple helpful hints, and then I'm going to ask you to all do the exercise. So you can see on the screen here, the beneficiary service exercise
Do we have a hard copy of this?
Grounded in the ranking of your categories.
I can go print
And a
some.
financial resource allocation philosophy for a cost recovery strategy provides a foundation for differentiating services
Very hard to read
based
this.
on benefits if we should pay. Economists in the U.S. economy have differentiated goods and services in this manner for decades. So this is not a new way of thinking about beneficiary of service or how we're going to invest taxpayer resources. Adopting a philosophy that acknowledges levels of service shifts from a philosophy suggesting that all services are of equal value and should be provided for everyone to a philosophy where financial resource allocation decisions or how we invest taxpayer resources are based upon the beneficiary. In this concept, each service category has a set of specific characteristics, in our case, definitions and examples, that provide a rationale for who should pay, whether it's the taxpayers, the individual, or maybe both, and to what degree. Ultimately, this aligns our resource allocation philosophy with the beneficiary of service. So I want to direct your attention to the two definitions in the body of this exercise. And it's really important we understand when we say common good or community benefit, we tend to throw those terms out quite often, but we really need to understand what they mean. So common good for the purposes of our exercise this evening are those services that are accessible, of benefit to all in your community, and provide universal value. Essentially, these are services that contribute to your common good and can be characterized as essential or your must-haves, having community-wide interest and far-reaching impacts. Alternatively, individualized services provide exclusive benefit to the individual and can include constraints or barriers to access. Essentially, these services benefit the individual more than the community as a whole and can be characterized as discretionary or your nice-to-haves with less of a community-wide impact. So my ask of you this evening is to place your service categories from the category you believe provides the most community benefit or benefits the common good, being the number one service category, to the category that you believe is most individualized or specialized, being your number 13 category. And then you're going to work between those two and fill in the blanks, 1 through 13. Please, no self-talk around what you think things cost, how much you think you can charge. This exercise has absolutely nothing to do with the money, has nothing to do with funding, it has nothing to do with fees. Trust me when I say we will get there as we complete the cost of service work. We will get there, right? We'll fill in the blanks in the continuum. But tonight is simply about who benefits from the services you provide. No self-talk about money. And finally, the last thing I'll share, and it's just a suggestion, I've been doing this for quite a long time, although I have to admit, in our new virtual reality, we've adapted. So we typically do this in person. This is a suggestion that most people, I think, benefit from, and that is you may want to approach this from a bookends perspective, meaning identify the number 1 category, then the number 13 category, then the number 2 category, and 12, and work your way towards the middle. If you're more of a linear thinker and doer, you may want to just go 1 to 13 or 13 to 1. It's entirely up to you. It's just simply a suggestion for consideration. So with that, I have found that the sweet spot to do this exercise virtually is right around 8 minutes. So I'm going to give you all 8 minutes to complete the exercise, but trust me, I will come back in and do a check-in, and if any of you need an additional minute or two, I'm happy to grant that for you. I don't want you to rush through and compromise the quality of your exercise, but I will check in with you in 8 minutes. Right now I have 58 minutes after the hour, so at 6 minutes after the hour, I'll check in to see if anybody needs additional time. I'm going to put the categories back on the screen. I'm going to mute myself and take myself off camera for the 8 minutes, and I will be back shortly with all of you. righty, I'm doing a check-in. Does anybody require any additional time? You'd simply either unmute yourself and just say yes, or put your comment in the chat box that you need more time. That would be great. Does anyone need additional time? All right, hearing none, seeing none. Wasn't that fun?
Mm-hmm.
I'm looking for someone smiling back at me and I'm just not seeing it.
I needed more 7, 8s, and 9s.
Okay, so here's how this is gonna work. We're in the home stretch. So it looks like we've got 10 commission and PrAC members on the line this evening. And I know we have a few staff as well. Staff participated in this last week. So the only folks I'm asking to share their responses with me this evening are commission members and PrAC members, please, so that I don't have duplicates of staff. What I'm going to ask you to do, first of all, is activate your cameras if you'd be kind enough. And clearly we're adapting to this new reality. So what I'm going to ask you to do is when I say the name or I say a service category, I'm simply going to ask you by show of hands and fingers which position you place that category in. Now, if you'd be kind enough to just hold up your answer, your fingers, until I tell you to put them down, that would be great. I'm going to be capturing your responses, and I know this is a recorded meeting as well. So in the event we need to, we can go to the tape. Finally, if any of you are not able to activate your camera, if you would be kind enough to send your completed sheet to Rochelle so that we can make sure we capture your responses, I would appreciate that. But it looks like most everyone, if not everyone, is on camera with me this evening, so that's great. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing my slides just for this portion of our work together. And again, I'm going to go through each category. I'm going to name the category and just simply show me with your fingers which position you place it in. When we get to 11, 12, and 13, simply for 11, show me 2 index fingers, 2 digits. For 12, a 1 and a 2, and for 13, a 1 and a 3. And that'll be the way we do it. Okay? Have fun with it. This is the fun part of tonight. So,
I'm using those.
So I can see all of you. And let's see. All right, so a few of you, again, I'm not seeing on screen here. A couple of the names I recognize as staff. All righty, so we're going to start with the first category listed, and that is community events. Which position did you place community events in? And again, keep your hands up until I tell you to put them down. That'd be great.
Turned my hand so
I'm having to pan through the group here, so bear with us.
Turn it this way, if the camera's
turn your
here.
fingers.
There you go.
All right, great. I think I've got y'all. Thank you. All right, next category, drop-in access.
I might need to.
Drop-in access in.
Which one? Drop-in access?
Drop-in access.
Drop-in access.
I don't have enough hands. The Vulcan salute.
Karen, is that a 2?
It's a wandering 2.
Okay, your fingers are so close to the screen, I wanted to make sure I got them all. Okay, great. Thank you. Next category, enrichment and wellness. Which position did you place enrichment and wellness in? Is that a 5?
Karen, with an additional number.
In me here, Karen.
I'm trying a 7. Come on.
Okay. Andy, 6. And Frank, I didn't get you. Great, thank you. Terrific.
Impressive.
All right, next category,
I'm
food
too.
and beverage. Which position did you place food and beverage in?
How do you put up?
'What did you have there?
13, maybe?
Rocky, do you know how to count your fingers?
I can't remember how I'm supposed to do 12.
A 1 and a 2.
Oh, yeah, that makes sense. Okay. But how do you know that's not a 3?
One hand.
One hand, Rocky.
All right. I got it.
Got it.
Thank you.
I'm just like, math me, why don't you help him out?
It's Karen. I'm with Rocky on 12, but my other finger would.
What if you do this?
All right, next
Use
category
that one.
is human services. Which position did you place human services in?
There you go.
Great, thank you. Next category is inclusion. Which position did you place inclusion in?
That one. Extra points if you do the Vulcan salute.
All right, Sean.
John's got it.
Yep.
All right, Sean, awesome.
Great, thank you. Next category are your merchandise for resale items. Aaron, what is that?
It's like a 9.
Me trying to get my hands far enough above my
Just say what the number is.
Or write it down.
Just say what number it is.
Great. Next, open access.
I think this is a losing battle here.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I can't see that.
7.
Okay, thanks. Great, thank you. Next, rentals. Karen, can you pull your hand back away from the screen for me, if you don't mind? I'm having a tough time.
I keep trying. I just stood up and it didn't even make a difference.
Okay,
13.
great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
All right, terrific. Thank you. Next, skill-based advanced competitive. All right, thank you. Home stretch. Skill-based beginner intermediate.
Is that a hashtag sign, Rocky?
Great, thank you.
Looked like he was
Special
going like
events.
this.
Your special events category.
I'm using the background.
I like that, Sean. That's an alternative for 10.
And this is not intuitive. I'm at 9, Karen.
All right. All right. Last but not least, specialized services.
He's having a Maybe I should turn my hands the other way because you can see my painted
You should
nails.
mess with them and say, is that 54 or 45?
Yeah.
All right. Thank you for playing. It's amazing how we've all adapted to, again, this new reality. So wasn't long ago we were doing these workshops and work sessions in person. So again, just a quick reminder, this is where we're headed. Your feedback this evening, appreciated certainly and incredibly valuable, and it will be added to what we heard from staff and the various stakeholders this past week. But we're working towards the development of this continuum, ultimately as a cost recovery strategy for the organization. Once we have the cost of service analysis complete, we've ranked the categories on the continuum, be able to include the goals and targets based upon current performance. It will allow the organization to have a draft of their of the cost recovery strategy for the system. Real quickly, so you know what's immediately next around the corner, we're going to be synthesizing your responses this evening. We'll be adding those to the feedback we receive from staff and stakeholders, and it will provide us, again, an opportunity to place each category on the continuum based upon all of the feedback we received. Ultimately, where we're headed, of course, is the design of the department's beneficiary service model initially. And then again, once the cost of service analysis is completed, then the project team will begin using that data as well as other guideposts to help help them make informed decisions concerning what their cost recovery goals can be over the next couple of years. And I'm certain that Kendall and team will keep you apprised of developments and obviously progress as we move forward. So with that, I want to open it up for any final thoughts, comments, questions before we wrap up this evening.
So Jamie, how do you want us to send in our forms that we filled out? Or send them to who?
So if you're open to that, that would be great. Send them to Rochelle. We'll have that as a backup to what we collected tonight, as well as the recording of this evening's meeting. But if you want to do that, it certainly wouldn't hurt, because then we'll have that as a backup to make sure that all of the information we've collected is accurate.
I just wanted to say I thought this was very informative, and I'm looking forward to the next process. And I do want to say this publicly, Jamie, you are an excellent public speaker. I'm very impressed.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that.
Okay.
Hey, Jamie, I have a couple of questions for you.
Sure.
So back in the great presentation, by the way, really enjoyed it. Back when in the earlier part of your presentation with the Penn study, did the policymakers reason why they felt recreation was less likely to attract and retain business? And did they go on to further analysis as to what type of business?
Great question. I don't know that there were any kind of grounding rationale for that assumption. It's interesting because it's contrary to our field's research, which suggests that we're one of the reasons that businesses move to communities is the quality of park and recreation services, the quality of parks in particular. So it's contrary to what we suggest and the story that we tell. The interesting thing that Andy and his team, though, took away from that was one of the principal suggestions made by these policymakers was that recreation is one of the services within local government that has the ability to generate revenue. So many many municipal services don't have the ability to generate revenues like recreation services do. So while that was a rationale for their decision, it wasn't the only reason. There were alternative suggestions made, again, specific to the fact that parks and recreation can be a revenue engine for our municipality, for our system, for our district. And many, again, local government services cannot be. So I'm now interested, based upon your question, as to whether or not there were some, little nuggets of information that we can use in our work that would further explain why they believe that Parks and Recreation isn't a contributor to their number one concern, which is attracting and retaining business again, because we've been studying this stuff and telling that story for decades, that we are a reason why. The quality of schools and local parks are two of the primary reasons businesses do relocate. So I don't know. That's a fantastic question. I'm going to have to go dig and find out to see if I can find out if there's information that Andy has that he hasn't shared. And by the way, if you want to see the results of that study as well as the Great Recession's impact on Parks and Recreation, if you Google National Recreation and Park Association, and in particular the Great Recession's impact on Parks and Recreation, there's an extensive study and an article that was written that's summarized in our national publication. So you can get those summaries for both of those studies.
Okay, thank you. And then regarding the 13 service categories, and maybe this is more of a question for Kendall or the project team that's behind the cost recovery project, but do we have any data as to what % of the Oregon City population or any numbers of participants are in each of the categories of the different 13 categories?
I don't believe we have that data in regards to the number of people associated with each category. And Rochelle, you can correct me if I'm wrong.
No, you're correct, Kendall. The data is purely analyzing what we put our indirect and our direct costs, and that's how we're analyzing our costs right now.
Okay, I was just curious, so.
I would add that the cost recovery tool that we use will allow you to see participant numbers for almost every service you provide, with the exception of a few things like open access, right? Tracking the number of people that use your parks, right, in your playgrounds. That's clearly not going to be in there, but for many of the activities, classes, courses that we're evaluating, some of that data will be available to staff once the cost of service analysis is done, so they'll be able to illustrate that for you.
Thank you.
Hey, Derek?
Yeah, this is more of just a comment for the city folk. I did like the Louisville, I believe it was Louisville, where they took the model and they made on the beneficiary model and removed the cost recovery and flipped it. Jamie had mentioned that. I think that creates definitely more of a positive way of putting it than cost recovery. And I hope we were able to use that or look at it.
I agree with you. I think that messaging is 100 times better than the opposite. Any other final comments, questions for Jamie? All right. Well, I certainly appreciate, Jamie, you coming and presenting. I agree with Commissioner McGriff. It was a great presentation. I'm really intrigued by the study. I'm excited to see the results and where this goes next. And thanks to Kendall for bringing it to us and hosting the joint meeting with PRAC. I love exercises like the one we did last night. I'm kind of a data geek, so that's right up my alley. I thought it was lots of fun. So on that, are there any final communications from City Manager? No? Anything from you, Kendall, that you wanted to say before we wrapped up?
I'd just like to thank everyone for making themselves available to be a part of this process. I really think that this process and this cost recovery training is going to really make an impact on our department and help us better serve this community so we can make a greater impact with our resources. So I'd just like to thank all of you for being a part of it, and thank my staff for the work that they've been putting in to this process as well.
All right.
Karen has her hand raised. Karen?
I'm just going to give a final thank you to the commission. Kendall has been a wonderful addition to the department, and as chair of PRAC, I still want to meet the man, but working with him has been wonderful. Our interim was incredible, and I'm looking so forward to us moving ahead in the Parks and Recreation Department.
Me too. Thank you, Karen.
We all are.
Yeah, we're with you, Karen. All right, so with that, I think we are done for this evening and this meeting, so I'm going to adjourn. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, Andy.
See ya.
Night, everyone.